Good morning and welcome back to another episode of Sister for Sister Story Time with your favorite sister, Shia, the Hood Historian. Today we are still reading The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. If you would like to purchase the book, it is in the description. Today, the chapter we are starting at is The Wonders of Antiquity. It was a common practice among the early Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans to seal lighted lamps in the sepulchres of their dead as offerings to the god of death. Possibly, it was also believed that the deceased could use these lights in finding his way through the valley of the shadow. Later, as the custom became generally established, not only actual lamps but miniatures of them in terracotta were buried with the dead. Some of the lamps were enclosed in circular vessels for protection, and instances have been recorded in which the original oil was found in them in a perfect state of preservation after more than 2,000 years. There is ample proof that many of these lamps were burning when the sepulchres were sealed, and it has been declared that they were still burning when the vaults were opened hundreds of years later. The possibility of preparing a fuel which would renew itself as rapidly as it was consumed has been a source of considerable controversy among medieval authors. After due consideration of the evidence at hand, it seems well within the range of possibility that the ancient priest chemists did manufacture lamps that burned, if not indefinitely, at least for considerable periods of time. Numerous authorities have written on the subject of ever-burning lamps. W. Wynne Westcott estimates the number of writers who have given the subject consideration as more than 150, and H.P. Blavatsky as 173. While conclusions reached by different authors are at variance, a majority admit the existence of these phenomenal lamps. Only a few maintain that the lamps would burn forever, but many were willing to concede that they might remain alight for several centuries without replenishment of the fuel. Some considered the so-called perpetual lights as mere artifices of the crafty pagan priest, while a great many, admitting that the lamps actually burned, made the sweeping assertion that the devil was using this apparent miracle to ensnare the credulous and thereby lead their souls to perdition. On this subject, the learned Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, usually dependable, exhibits a striking inconsistency in his Setipus Egypticus. He writes, "Not a few of these ever-burning lamps have been found to be the devices of devils, and I take it that all the lamps found in the tombs of the Gentiles dedicated to the worship of certain gods were of this kind, not because they burned or have been reported to burn with a perpetual flame, but because probably the devil set them there, maliciously intending thereby to obtain fresh credence for a false worship." Having admitted that dependable authorities defend the existence of the ever burning lamps and that even the devil lends himself to their manufacturer, Kircher next declared the entire theory to be desperate and impossible and to be classed with perpetual motion and the philosopher's stone. Having already solved the problem to his satisfaction once, Kircher solves it again, but differently in the following words. In Egyptian, there are rich deposits of asphalt and petroleum. What did these clever fellows, the priests, do then but connect an oil deposit by a secret duct with one or more lamps, provided with wicks of asbestos? How could such lamps help burning perpetually? In my opinion, this is the solution of the riddle of the supernatural everlastingness of these ancient lamps. Montfaucon, in his Antiquities, agrees in the main with the later deductions of Kircher, believing the fabled perpetual lamps of the temples to be cunning mechanical contrivances. He further adds that the belief that lamps burned indefinitely in tombs was the result of the noteworthy fact that in some cases fumes resembling smoke poured forth from the entrances of newly opened vaults. Parties going in later and discovering lamps scattered about the floor assumed that they were the source of the fumes. There are several interesting stories concerning the discoveries of ever-burning lamps in various parts of the world. In a tomb on the Appian Way, which was opened during the papacy of Paul III, was found a burning lamp which had remained alight in a hermetically sealed vault for nearly 1600 years. According to an account written by a contemporary, a body, that of a young and beautiful girl with long golden hair, was found floating in an unknown transparent liquid and as well preserved as though death had occurred but a few hours before. About the interior of the vault were a number of significant objects, which included several lamps, one of them alight. Those entering the sepulchre declared that the draft caused by the opening of the door blew out the light and the lamp could not be relighted. Kircher reproduces an epitaph, Tullio Feli Me, supposedly found in the tomb, but which Montfaucon declares never existed. The latter adding that although conclusive evidence was not found, the body was generally believed to be that of Tulliola, the daughter of Cicero. Ever-burning lamps have been discovered in all parts of the world, not only the Mediterranean countries, but also India, Tibet, China, and South America have contributed records of lights which burned continuously without fuel. The examples which follow were selected at random from the imposing list of perpetual lamps found in different ages. Plutarch wrote of a lamp that burned over the door of a temple to Jupiter Ammon. The priest declared that it had remained alight for centuries without fuel. St. Augustine described a perpetual lamp guarded in a temple in Egypt sacred to Venus, which never wind nor water could extinguish. He believed it to be the work of the devil. An ever-burning lamp was found at Edessa or Antioch during the reign of the Emperor Justinian. It was in a niche over the city gate, elaborately enclosed to protect it from the elements. The date upon it proved that the lamp had been burning for more than 500 years. It was destroyed by soldiers. During the early Middle Ages, a lamp was found in England which had burned since the 3rd century after Christ. The monument containing it was believed to be the tomb of the father of Constantine the Great. The lantern of Pallas was discovered near Rome in AD 1401. It was found in the sepulchre of Pallas, son of Evander, immortalized by Virgil in his Aeneid. The lamp was placed at the head of the body and had burned with a steady glow for more than 2,000 years. In AD 1550, on the island of Nessus in the Bay of Naples, a magnificent marble vault was opened in which was found a lamp still alight, which had been placed there before the beginning of the Christian era. Pausanias described a beautiful golden lamp in the temple of Minerva, which burned steadily for a year without refueling or having the wick trimmed. The ceremony of filling the lamp took place annually, and time was measured by the ceremony. According to the Fama Fraternitatis, the crypt of Christian Rosencruts, when opened 120 years after his death, was found to be brilliantly illuminated by a perpetual lamp suspending from the ceiling. Numa Pompilius, king of Rome and magician of considerable power, caused a perpetual light to burn in the dome of a temple he had created in honor of an elemental being. In England, a curious tomb was found containing an automaton which moved when certain stones in the floor of the vault were stepped upon by an intruder. At that time, the Rosicrucian controversy was at its height, so it was decided that the tomb was that of a Rosicrucian initiate. A countryman, discovering the tomb and entering, found the interior brilliantly lighted by a lamp hanging from the ceiling. As he walked, his weight depressed some of the floor stones. At once, a seated figure in heavy armor began to move. Mechanically, it rose to its feet and struck the lamp with an iron baton, completely destroying it, and thus effectually preventing the discovery of the secret substance which maintained the flame. How long the lamp had burned is unknown, but certainly it had been for a considerable number of years. It is related that among the tombs near Memphis and in the Brahmin temples of India, lights have been found in sealed chambers and vessels, but sudden exposure to the air has extinguished them and caused their fuel to evaporate. It is now believed that the wicks of these perpetual lamps were made of braided or woven asbestos, called by the alchemist salamander's wool, and that the fuel was one of the products of the alchemical research. Kircher attempted to extract oil from asbestos, being convinced that as the substance itself was indestructible by fire, and oil extracted from it would supply the lamp with the fuel likewise indestructible. After spending 2 years in fruitless experimental work, he concluded that the task was impossible of accomplishment. Several formulae for the making of the fuel for the lamps have been preserved. In Isis Unveiled, H.P. Blavatsky reprints two of these formulae from early authors, Tridenheim and Bartolomeo Korndorf. One will suffice to give a general understanding of the process. Sulfur, alum, sublime them into flowers, of which add of crystalline Venetian borax powdered. Upon these infuse high rectified spirit of wine and digest it, then abstract it and pour on fresh. Repeat this so often till the sulfur melts like wax without any smoke upon a hot plate of brass. This is for the pabulum, but the wick is to be prepared after this manner. Gather the threads or thrums of the lapis asbestos to the thickness of your middle and the length of your little finger, then put them in a Venetian glass, and covering them over with the aforesaid depurated sulfur or ailment, set the glass in sand for the space of 24 hours, so hot that the sulfur may bubble all the while. The wick being thus besmeared and anointed is to be put into a glass like a scallop shell, in such manner that some part of it may lie above the mass of prepared sulfur. Then, setting this glass upon hot sand, you must melt the sulfur so that it may lay hold of the wick, and when it is lighted, it will burn with the perpetual flame, and you may set this lamp in any place where you please. The Greek oracles. The worship of Apollo included the establishment and maintenance of places of prophecy by means of which the gods could communicate with mankind and reveal futurity to such as deserved the boon. The early history of Greece abounds with accounts of talking trees, rivers, statues, and caves in which nymphs, dryads, or demons had taken up their abodes and from which they delivered oracles. While Christian authors have tried to prove that oracular revelations were delivered by the devil for the purpose of misleading humanity, they have not dared to attack the theory of oracles because of the repeated reference to it in their own sacred writings. If the onyx stones on the shoulders of Israel's high priest flashing the will of Jehovah, the white dove, temporarily annulled the faculty of speech, could indeed pronounce oracles in the temple of Jupiter Ammon. If the witch of Endor could invoke the shade of Samuel, who in turn gave prophecies to Saul, could not a priestess of Apollo call up the specter of her liege to foretell the destiny of Greece? The most famous oracles of antiquity were those of Delphi, Dodona, Trophonius, and Latona, of which the talking oak trees of Dodona were the oldest. Though it is impossible to trace back to the genesis of the theory of oracular prophecy, it is known that many of the caves and fissures set aside by the Greeks as oracles were sacred long before the rise of Greek culture. The Oracle of Apollo at Delphi remains one of the unsolved mysteries of the ancients. Alexander Wilder derives the name Delphi from Delphos, the womb. This name was chosen by the Greeks because of the shape of the cavern and the vent leading into the depths of the earth. The original name of the oracle was Pytho, so called because its chambers had been the abode of the great serpent Python, a fearsome creature that had crept out of the slime left by the receding flood that had destroyed all human beings except Deucalion and Pyrrha. Apollo, climbing the side of Mount Parnassus, slew the serpent after a prolonged combat and threw the body down the fissure of the oracle. From that time, the sun god, surnamed the Pythian Apollo, gave oracles from the vent. With Dionysus, he shared the honor of being the patron god of Delphi. Base of a Delphian tripod from Montfaucon's Antiquities. The windings of these serpents formed the base, and the three heads sustained the 3 feet of the tripod. It is impossible to secure satisfactory information concerning the shape and size of the celebrated Delphian tripod. Theories concerning it are based in most part on small orange tripods discovered in various temples. The Delphian tripod restored from Beaumont's Gleanings of Antiquities. According to Beaumont, the above is the most authentic form of the Delphian tripod extant, but as the tripod must have changed considerably during the life of the oracle, hasty conclusions are unwise. In his description of the tripod, Beaumont divides it into 4 parts. 1, a frame with 3, 2, a reverberating basin or bowl set in the frame, a flat plate or table upon which the Pythia sat, and 4, a cone-shaped cover of the table, which completely concealed the priestess, and from beneath which her voice sounded forth in weird and hollow tones. Attempts have been made to relate the Delphian tripod with the Jewish Ark of the Covenant. The frame of 3 legs was likened to the Ark of the Covenant, the flat plate or table to the mercy seat, and the cone-shaped covering to the tent of the tabernacle itself. This entire conception differs widely from that popularly accepted, but discloses a valuable analogy between Jewish and Greek symbolism. After being vanquished by Apollo, the spirit of Python remained at Delphi as the representative of his conqueror, and it was with the aid of his effluvium that the priestess was able to become in rapport with the god. The fumes rising from the fissure of the oracle were supposed to come from the decaying body of Python. The name Pythoness or Pythia, given to the female hierophant of the oracle, means literally one who has been thrown into a religious frenzy by inhaling fumes rising from decomposing matter. It is of further interest to note that the Greeks believed the oracle of Delphi to be the umbilicus of the earth, thus providing that they considered the planet an immense human being. The connection between the principle of oracular revelation and the occult significance of the navel is an important secret belonging to the ancient mysteries. The Pythian Apollo from Historia Diorum Fatidicorum. Apollo, the twin brother of Diana, was the son of Jupiter and Latona. Apollo was fully adult at the time of his birth. He was considered to be the first physician and the inventor of music and song. The Greeks also acclaimed him to be the father of the bow and arrow. The famous temple of Apollo at Delphi was rebuilt 5 times. The first temple was formed only of laurel branches. The second was somewhat similar. The third was brass, and the fourth and fifth were probably of marble, of considerable size and great beauty. No other oracle in Greece equaled in magnificence that of Delphi in the zenith of its power. Writers declared that it contained many statues of solid gold and silver, marvelous ornaments, and implements of the most valuable materials and beautiful workmanship, donated by princes and kings who came from all parts of the civilized world to consult the spirit of Apollo dwelling in his sanctuary. The oracle, however, is much older than the foregoing account indicates. A story of this kind was probably invented by the priest to explain the phenomena to those inquisitive persons whom they did not consider worthy of enlightenment regarding the true esoteric nature of the oracle. Some believe that the Delphic fissure was discovered by a Hyperborean priest, but as far back as recorded history goes, the cave was sacred, and persons came from all parts of Greece and the surrounding countries to question the demon who dwelt in its chimney-like vent. Priests and priestesses guarded it closely and served the spirit who dwelt therein and who enlightened humanity through the gift of prophecy. The story of the original discovery of the oracle is somewhat as follows. Shepherds tending their flocks on the side of Mount Parnassus were amazed at the peculiar antics of goats that wandered close to a great chasm on its southwestern spur. The animals jumped about as though trying to dance and emitted strange cries unlike anything before heard. At last, one of the shepherds, curious to learn the cause of the phenomenon, approached the vent from which were rising noxious fumes. Immediately, he was seized with a prophetic ecstasy. He danced with wild abandon, sang, jabbered inarticulate sounds, and foretold future events. Others went close to the fissure with the same result. The fame of the place spread, and many came to learn of the future by inhaling the mephitic fumes, which exhilarated to the verge of delirium. Some of those who came, being unable to control themselves and having temporarily the strength of madmen, tore themselves from those seeking to restrain them, and jumping into the vent, perished. In order to prevent others from doing likewise, a wall was erected around the fissure, and a prophetess was appointed to act as mediator between the oracle and those who came to question it. According to later authorities, a tripod of gold ornamented with carvings of Apollo in the form of Python, the great serpent, was placed over the cleft, and on this was arranged a specially prepared seat, so constructed that a person would have difficulty in falling off while under the influence of the oracular fumes. Just before this time, a story had been circulated that the fumes of the oracle arose from the decaying body of Python. It is possible that the oracle revealed its own origin. For many centuries during its early history, virgin maidens were consecrated to the service of the oracle. They were called the Phobades or Pythia, and constituted that famous order now known as the Pythian priesthood. It is probable that women were chosen to receive the oracles because their sensitive and emotional nature responded more quickly and completely to the fumes of enthusiasm. 3 days before the time set to receive the communications from Apollo, the virgin priestess began the ceremony of purification. She bathed in the Castalian well, abstained from all food, drank only from the fountain of Cassitus, which was brought into the temple through concealed pipes, and just before mounting the tripod, she chewed a few leaves of the sacred bay tree. It has been said that the water was drugged to bring on distorted visions, or the priests of Delphi were able to manufacture an exhilarating and intoxicating gas, which they conducted by subterranean ducts and released into the shaft of the oracle several feet below the surface. Neither of these theories has been proved, however, nor does either in any way explain the accuracy of the predictions. When the young prophetess had completed the process of purification, she was clothed in sanctified raiment and led to the tripod, upon which she seated herself, surrounded by the noxious vapors rising from the yawning fissure. Gradually, as she inhaled the fumes, a change came over her. It was as if a different spirit had entered her body. She struggled, tore her clothing, and uttered inarticulate cries. After a time, her struggles ceased. Upon becoming calm, a great majesty seemed to possess her, and with eyes fixed on space and body rigid, she uttered the prophetic words. The predictions were usually in the form of hexameter verse, but the words were often ambiguous and sometimes unintelligible. Every sound that she made, every motion of her body was carefully recorded by the 5 Hasi, or holy men, who were appointed as scribes to preserve the minutest details of each divination. The Hasi were appointed for life and were chosen from the direct descendants of Deucalion. After the oracle was delivered, the Pythia began to struggle again, and the spirit released her. She was then carried or supported to a chamber of rest, where she remained till the nervous ecstasy had passed away. Imblicus, in his dissertation on the mysteries, describes how the spirit of the oracle, a fiery demon, even Apollo himself, took control of the Pythoness and manifested through her. But the prophetess in Delphi, whether she gives oracles to mankind through an attenuated and fiery spirit bursting from the mouth of the cavern, or whether being seated in the adytum on a brazen tripod, or on a stool with 4 feet, she becomes sacred to the god. Whichsoever of these is the case, she entirely gives herself up to a divine spirit and is illuminated with a ray of divine fire. And when indeed fire ascending from the mouth of the cavern circularly invests her in collected abundance, she becomes filled from it with a divine splendor. But when she places herself on the seat of the god, she becomes co-adapted to his stable prophetic power. And from both of these preparatory operations, she becomes wholly possessed by the god. And then indeed he is present with and illuminates her in a separate manner, and is different from the fire, the spirit, the proper seat, and in short, from all the visible apparatus of the place, whether physical or sacred. Among the celebrities who visited the oracle of Delphi were the immortal Apollonius of Tyana and his disciple Damis. He made his offerings, and after being crowned with a laurel wreath and given a branch of the same plant to carry in his hand, he passed behind the statue of Apollo, which stood before the entrance to the cave, and descended into the sacred place of the oracle. The priestess was also crowned with laurel, and her head bound with a band of white wool. Apollonius asked the oracle if his name would be remembered by future generations. The Pythoness answered in the affirmative, but declared that it would always be calumniated. Apollonius left the cavern in anger, but time has proved the accuracy of the prediction, for the early church fathers perpetuated the name of Apollonius as the Antichrist. For details of the story, see History de la Magie. The messages given to the virgin prophetess were turned over to the philosophers of the oracle, whose duty it was to interpret and apply them. The communications were then delivered to the poets, who immediately translated them into odes and lyrics, setting forth in exquisite form the statements supposedly made by Apollo and making them available for the populace. Serpents were much in evidence at the Oracle of Delphi. The base of the tripod upon which the Pythia sat was formed of the twisted bodies of three gigantic snakes. According to some authorities, one of the processes used to produce the prophetic ecstasy was to force the young priestess to gaze into the eyes of a serpent. Fascinated and hypnotized, she then spoke with the voice of the god. Although the early Pythian priestesses were always maidens, some still in their teens, a law was later enacted that only women past 50 years of age should be the mouthpiece of the oracle. These older women dressed as young girls and went through the same ceremonial as the first Pythia. The change was probably the indirect result of a series of assaults made upon the persons of the priestesses by the profane. During the early history of the Delphian oracle, the god spoke only at each seventh birthday of Apollo. As time went on, however, the demand became so great that the Pythia was forced to seat herself upon the tripod every month. The times selected for the consultation and the questions to be asked were determined by lot or by vote of the inhabitants of Delphi. It is generally admitted that the effect of the Delphian oracle upon Greek culture was profoundly constructive. James Gardner sums up its influence in the following words. Its responses revealed many a tyrant and foretold his fate. Through its means, many an unhappy being was saved from destruction, and many a perplexed mortal guided in the right way. It encouraged useful institutions and promoted the progress of useful discoveries. Its moral influence was on the side of virtue, and its political influence in favor of the advancement of civil liberty. The oracle of Dodona was presided over by Jupiter, who uttered prophecies through oak trees, birds, and vases of brass. Many writers have noted the similarities between the rituals of Dodona and those of the Druid priests of Britain and Gaul. The famous oracular dove of Dodona alighting upon the branches of the sacred oaks, not only discoursed at length in the Greek tongue upon philosophy and religion, but also answered the queries of those who came from the distant places to consult it. The talking trees stood together, forming a sacred grove. When the priest desired answers to important questions, after careful and solemn purifications, they retired to the grove. They then accosted the trees, beseeching a reply from the God who dwelt therein. When they had stated their questions, the trees spoke with the voices of human beings, revealing to the priest the desired information. Some assert there was but one tree which spoke, an oak or a beech standing in the very heart of the ancient grove. Because Jupiter was believed to inhabit this tree, he was sometimes called Phigonus, or one who lives in a beech tree. Most curious of the oracles of Dodona were the talking basses or kettles. These were made of brass and so carefully fashioned that when struck, they gave off sound for hours. Some writers have described a row of these vases as have declared that if one of them was struck, its vibrations would be communicated to all the others and a terrifying din ensued. Other authors describe a large single vase standing up on a pillar near which stood another column supporting the statue of a child holding a whip. At the end of the whip were a number of swinging cords tipped with small metal balls, and the wind, which blew incessantly through the open building, caused the balls to strike against the vase. The number and intensity of the impacts and the reverberations of the vase were all carefully noted, and the priests delivered their oracles accordingly. The Dodonian Jupiter, from Historia Diorum Fata Decorum. Jupiter was called Dodonian after the city of Dodona in Epirus. Near this city was a hill thickly covered with oak trees, which from the most ancient times had been sacred to Jupiter. The grove was further venerated because dryads, fauns, satyrs, and nymphs were believed to dwell in its depths. From the ancient oaks and beeches were hung many chains of tiny bronze bells, which tinkled day and night as the wind swayed the branches. Some assert that the celebrated talking dove of Dodona was in reality a woman, because in Thessaly, both prophetesses and doves were called Pleiades. Pallades, yeah, whatever. It is supposed that the first temple of Dodona was erected by Deucalion and those who survived the Great Flood with him. For this reason, the oracle at Dodona was considered the oldest in Greece. When the original priest of Dodona, the Seloi, mysteriously vanished, the oracle was served for many centuries by 3 priestesses who interpreted the vases and at midnight interrogated the sacred trees. The patrons of the oracles were expected to bring offerings and to make contributions. Another remarkable oracle was the cave of Trophonius, which stood upon the side of a hill with an entrance so small that it seemed impossible for a human being to enter. After the consultant had made his offering at the statue of Trophonius and had donned the sanctified garments, he climbed the hill to the cave, carrying in one hand a cake of honey. Sitting down at the edge of the opening, he lowered his feet into the cavern. Thereupon his entire body was precipitately drawn into the cave, which was described by those who had entered it as having only the dimensions of a fair-sized oven. When the oracle had completed its revelation, the consultant, usually delirious, was forcibly ejected from the cave, feet foremost. Near the cave of the oracle, 2 fountains bubbled out of the earth within a few feet of each other. Those about to enter the cave drank first from these fountains, the water of which seemed to possess peculiar occult properties. The first contained the water of forgetfulness, and all who drank thereof forgot their earthly sorrows. From the second fountain flowed the sacred water of Mnemosyne, or remembrance, for later it enabled those who partook of it to recall their experiences while in the cave. Though its entrance was marked by 2 brass obelisks, the cave, surrounded by a wall of white stones and concealed in the heart of a grove of sacred trees, did not present an imposing appearance. There is no doubt that those entering it passed through strange experiences, for they were obliged to leave at the adjacent temple a complete account of what they saw and heard while in the oracle. The prophecies were given in the form of dreams and visions and were accompanied by severe pains in the head. Some never completely recovered from the after effects of their delirium. The confused recital of their experiences was interpreted by the priest according to the question to be answered, while the priest probably used some unknown herb to produce the dreams or visions of the cavern. Their skill in interpreting them bordered on the supernatural. Before consulting the oracle, it was necessary to offer a ram to the demon of the cave, and the priest decided by hieromancy whether the time chosen was propitious and the sacrifice was satisfactory. Trophonius of Labadia, from Historia Diorum Fatidicorum. Trophonius and his brother Agamedes were famous architects. While building a certain treasure vault, they contrived to leave one stone movable so that they might secretly enter and steal the valuables stored there. A trap was set by the owner, who had discovered the plot, and Agamedes was caught. To prevent discovery, Trophonius decapitated his brother and fled, hotly pursued. He hid in the grove of Labadia, where the earth opened and swallowed him up. The spirit of Trophonius thereafter delivered oracles in the grove and its caverns. The name Trophonius means to be agitated, excited, or roiled. It was declared that the terrible experiences through which consultants passed in the oracle caverns so affected them that they never smiled again. The bees which accompany the figure of Trophonius were sacred because they led the first envoys from Boeotia to the site of the oracle. The figure above is said to be a production of a statue of Trophonius, which was placed on the brow of the hill above the oracle and surrounded with sharply pointed stakes that it could not be touched. The seven wonders of the world. Many of the sculptors and architects of the ancient world were initiates of the mysteries, particularly the Eleusinian rites. Since the dawn of time, the truers of stone and the hewers of wood have constituted a divinely overshadowed caste. As civilization spread slowly over the earth, cities were built and deserted. Monuments were erected to heroes at present unknown. Temples were built to gods who lie broken in the dust of the nations they inspired. Research has proved not only that the builders of these cities and monuments and the sculptors who chiseled out the inscrutable faces of the gods were masters of their crafts, but that in the world today there are none to equal them. The profound knowledge of mathematics and astronomy embodied in ancient architecture and the equally profound knowledge of anatomy revealed in Greek statuary proved that the fashioners of both were masterminds, deeply cultured in the wisdom which constituted the arcana of the mysteries. Thus was established the Guild of the Builders, progenitors of modern Freemasons. When employed to build palaces, temples, or combs, or to carve statues for the wealthy, those initiated architects and artists concealed in their works the secret doctrine, so that now, long after their bones have returned to dust, the world realizes that those first artisans were indeed duly initiated and worthy to receive the wages of master masons. The seven wonders of the world, while apparently designed for divers reasons, were really monuments erected to perpetuate the arcana of the mysteries. They were symbolic structures placed in peculiar spots, and the real purpose of their erection can be sensed only by the initiated. Eliphas Levi has noted the marked correspondence between these seven wonders and the seven planets. The seven wonders of the world were built by widows' sons in honor of the seven planetary genii. Their secret symbolism is the identical with that of the seven seals of Revelation and the seven churches of Asia. 1. The Colossus of Rhodes, a gigantic brass statue about 109 feet in height and requiring over 12 years to build, was the work of an initiated artist, Sherez of Lindus. The popular theory, accepted for several hundred years, that the figure stood with 1 foot on each side of the entrance to the harbor of Rhodes and that full rigid ships passed between its feet, has never been substantiated. Unfortunately, the figure remained standing but 56 years, being thrown down by an earthquake in 224 BC. The shattered parts of the Colossus lay scattered about the ground for more than 900 years when they were finally sold to a Jewish merchant who carried the metal away on the backs of 700 camels. Some believe that the brass was converted into munitions, and others that it was made into drainage pipes. The gigantic gilded figure with its crown of solar rays and its upraised torch signified occultly the glorious Son Man of the mysteries, the universal Savior. 2. The architect Ctesiphon in the 5th century BC submitted the Ionian cities a plan for erecting a joint monument to their patron goddess Diana. The place chosen was Ephesus, a city south of Smyrna. The building was constructed of marble. The roof was supported by 127 columns, each 60 feet high and weighing over 150 tons. The temple was destroyed by black magic in 356 BC, but the world fixes the odious crime upon the tool of means of which the destruction was accomplished, a mentally deranged man named Herostratus. It was later rebuilt by the symbolism, but the symbolism was lost. The original temple, designed as a miniature of the universe, was dedicated to the moon, the occult symbol of generation. Three, upon his exile from Athens, Phidias, the greatest of all the Greek sculptors, went to Olympia in the province of Elis and there designed his colossal statue of Zeus, chief of the gods of Greece. There is not even an accurate description of this masterpiece now in existence. Only a few old coins give an inadequate idea of its general appearance. The body of the god was overlaid with ivory and the robes were of beaten gold. In one hand, he is supposed to have held a globe supporting a figure of the goddess of victory. In the other, a scepter surmounted by an eagle. The head of Zeus was archaic, heavily bearded, and crowned with an olive wreath. The statue was seated upon an elaborately decorated throne. As its name implies, the monument was dedicated to the spirit of the planet Jupiter, one of the 7 Logi who bow before the Lord of the Sun. Eliphaz Levi includes the Temple of Solomon among the 7 wonders of the world, giving it the place occupied by the Pharaohs or lighthouse of Alexandria. The Pharos, named for the island upon which it stood, was designed and constructed by Sostratus of Cnidus during the reign of Ptolemy, 283 through 247 BC. It is described as being of white marble and over 600 feet high. Even in that ancient day, it cost nearly $1 million. Fires were lighted in the top of it and could be seen for miles out at sea. It was destroyed by an earthquake in the 13th century, but remains of it were visible until AD 1350. Being the tallest of the wonders, it was naturally assigned to Saturn, the father of the gods and the true illuminator of all humanity. Five, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus was a magnificent monument erected by Queen Artemisia in memory of her dead husband, King Mausolus, from whose name the word mausoleum is derived. The designers of the building were Satyrus and Pythis, and 4 great sculptors were employed to ornament the edifice. The building, which was 114 feet long and 92 feet wide, was divided into 5 major sections. The census and surmounted by a pyramid, the spiritual nature of man. The pyramid rose in 24 steps, a sacred number, and upon the apex was a statue of King Mausolus in a chariot. His figure was 9 feet, 9.5 inches tall. Many attempts have been made to reconstruct the monument, which was destroyed by an earthquake, but none has been altogether successful. This monument was sacred to the planet Mars and was built by an initiate for the enlightenment of the world. 6. The Gardens of Semiramis at Babylon, more commonly known as the Hanging Gardens, stood within the palace grounds of Nebuchadnezzar near the Euphrates River. They rose in a terrace-like pyramid, and on the top was a reservoir for the watering of the gardens. They were built about 600 BC, but the name of the landscape artist has not been preserved. They symbolized the plains of the invisible world and were consecrated to Venus as the goddess of love and beauty. 7. The Great Pyramid was supreme among the temples of the mysteries. In order to be true to its astronomical symbolism, it must have been constructed about 70,000 years ago. It was the tomb of Osiris and was believed to have been built by the gods themselves, and the architect may have been the immortal Hermes. It is the monument of Mercury, the messenger of the gods, and the universal symbol of wisdom and letters. The life and philosophy of Pythagoras. While Nisarchus, the father of Pythagoras, was in the city of Delphi on matters pertaining to his business as a merchant, he and his wife, Parthenis, decided to consult the oracle of Delphi as to whether the fates were favorable for their return voyage to Syria. When the Pythoness, prophetess of Apollo, seated herself on the golden tripod over the yawning vent of the oracle, she did not answer the question they had asked, but told Nisarchus that his wife was then with child and would give birth to a son who was destined to surpass all men in beauty and wisdom, and who throughout the course of his life would contribute much to the benefit of mankind. Nisarchus was so deeply impressed by the prophecy that he changed his wife's name to Pythagoras in honor of the Pythian priestess. When the child was born at Sidon in Phoenicia, it was, as the oracle had said, a son. Nisarchus and Pythagoras named the child Pythagoras, for they believed that he had been predestined by the oracle. Many strange legends have been preserved concerning the birth of Pythagoras. Some maintain that he was no mortal man, that he was one of the gods who had taken a human body to enable him to come into the world and instruct the human race. Pythagoras was one of the many sages and saviors of antiquity for whom an immaculate conception is asserted. In his Anacalypsis, Godfrey Higgins writes, "The first striking circumstance in which the history of Pythagoras agrees with the history of Jesus is that they were natives of nearly the same country, the former being born at Sidon, the latter at Bethlehem, both in Syria. The father of Pythagoras, as well as the father of Jesus, was prophetically informed that his wife should bring forth a son who should be a benefactor to mankind. They were both born with their mothers when their mothers were from home on journeys, Joseph and his wife having gone up to Bethlehem to be taxed, and the father of Pythagoras having traveled from Samos, his residence, to Sidon about his mercantile concerns. Pythias or Pythagoras, the mother of Pythagoras, had a connection with an Apolloniacal specter or ghost of the god Apollo or god Sol. Of course, this must have been a holy ghost, and here we have the Holy Ghost, which afterward appeared to her husband and told him that he must have no connection with his wife during her pregnancy. A story evidently the same as that relating to Joseph and Mary. From these peculiar circumstances, Pythagoras was known by the same title as Jesus, namely the Son of God, and was supposed by the multitude to be under the influence of divine inspiration. The most famous philosopher was born sometime between 600 and 590 BC, and the length of his life has been estimated at nearly 100 years. The teachings of Pythagoras indicate that he was thoroughly conversant with the precepts of Oriental and Occidental esotericism. He traveled among the Jews and was instructed by the rabbins concerning the secret traditions of Moses, the lawgiver of Israel. Later, the school of the Essenes was conducted chiefly for the purpose of interpreting the Pythagorean symbols. Pythagoras was initiated into the Egyptian, Babylonian, and Chaldean mysteries. Although it is believed by some that he was a disciple of Zoroaster, it is doubtful whether his instructor of that name was the god-man now revered by the Parsis. While accounts of his travels differ, historians agree that he visited many countries and studied at the feet of many masters. After having acquired all which it was possible for him to learn of the Greek philosophers and presumably become an initiate in the Eleusinian mysteries, he went to Egypt and, after many rebuffs and refusals, finally succeeded in securing initiation in the mysteries of Isis at the hands of the priest of Thebes. Then this intrepid joiner wended his way into Phoenicia and Syria, where the mysteries of Adonis were conferred upon him, and crossing to the valley of the Euphrates, he tarried long enough to become versed in the secret lore of the Chaldeans, who still dwelt in the vicinity of Babylon. Finally, he made his greatest and most historic venture through Media and Persia into the Hindustan, where he remained several years as a pupil and initiate of the learned Brahmins of Elephanta and Ellora. The same author adds that the name of Pythagoras is still preserved in the records of the Brahmins as Yavankarya, the Ionian teacher. Pythagoras was said to have been the first man to call himself a philosopher. In fact, the world is indebted to him for the word philosopher. Before that time, the wise men had called themselves sages, which was interpreted to mean those who know. Pythagoras was more modest. He coined the word philosopher, which he defined as one who is attempting to find out. After returning from his wanderings, Pythagoras established a school, or as it has been sometimes called, a university at Crotona, a Dorian colony in southern Italy. Upon his arrival at Crotona, he was regarded askance, but after a short time, those holding important positions in the surrounding colonies sought his counsel in matters of great moment. He gathered around him a small group of sincere disciples whom he instructed in the secret wisdom which had been revealed to him, and also in the fundamentals of occult mathematics, music, and astronomy, which he considered to be the triangular foundation of all the arts and sciences. When he was about 60 years old, Pythagoras married one of his disciples, and 7 children resulted from the union. His wife was a remarkably able woman who not only inspired him during the years of his life, but after his assassination continued to promulgate his doctrines. As is so often the case with genius, Pythagoras, by his outspokenness, incurred both political and personal enmity. Among those who came for initiation was one who, because Pythagoras refused to admit him, determined to destroy both the man and his philosophy. By means of false propaganda, this disgruntled one turned the minds of the common people against the philosopher. Without warning, a band of murderers descended upon the little group of buildings where the great teacher and his disciples dwelt, burned the structures, and killed Pythagoras. Accounts of the philosopher's death do not agree. Some say that he was murdered with his disciples, others that on escaping from Crotona with a small band of followers, he was trapped and burned alive by his enemies in a little house where the band had decided to rest for the night. Another account states that finding themselves trapped in the burning structure, the disciples threw themselves into the flames, making of their own bodies a bridge over which Pythagoras escaped, only to die of a broken heart a short time afterwards as the result of grieving over the apparent fruitlessness of his efforts to serve and illuminate mankind. Pythagoras, the first philosopher, from Historia Deorum Fatidicorum. During his youth, Pythagoras was a disciple of Pherecydes and Hermodamus, and while in his teens became renowned for the clarity of his philosophic concepts. In height, he exceeded 6 feet. His body was as perfectly formed as that of Apollo. Pythagoras was the personification of majesty and power, and in his presence felt humble and afraid. As he grew older, his physical power increased rather than waned, so that he approached the century mark. As he approached the century mark, he was actually in the prime of life. The influence of this great soul over those about him was such that a word of praise from Pythagoras filled his disciples with ecstasy, while one committed suicide because the master became momentarily irritated over something he had done. Pythagoras was so impressed by this tragedy that he never again spoke unkindly to or about anyone. His surviving disciples attempted to perpetuate his doctrines, but they were persecuted on every hand, and very little remains today as a testimonial to the greatness of this philosopher. It is said that the disciples of Pythagoras never addressed him or referred to him by his own name, but always as the master or that man. This may have been because of the fact that the name Pythagoras was believed to consist of a certain number of specially arranged letters with great sacred significance. The word magazine has printed an article by T.R. Prater showing that Pythagoras initiated his candidates by means of a certain formula concealed within the letters of his own name. This may explain why the word Pythagoras was so highly revered. After the death of Pythagoras, his school gradually disintegrated, but those who had benefited by its teachings revered the memory of the great philosopher, as during his life they had reverenced the man himself. As time went on, Pythagoras came to be regarded as a god rather than a man, and his scattered disciples were bound together by their common admiration for the transcendent genius of their teacher. Edward Schur, in his Pythagoras and the Delphic Mysteries, relates the following incident as illustrative of the bond of fellowship uniting the members of the Pythagorean school. One of them, who had fallen upon sickness and poverty, was kindly taken in by an innkeeper. Before dying, he traced a few mysterious signs, the pentagram, no doubt, on the door of the inn, and said to the host, "Do not be uneasy. One of my brothers will pay my debts." A year afterwards, as a stranger was passing by this inn, he saw the signs and said to the host, "I am a Pythagorean. One of my brothers died here. Tell me what I owe you on his account." Frank C. Higgins, 32 Degree, gives an excellent compendium of the Pythagorean tenets in the following outline. Pythagoras' teachings are of the most transcendental importance to Masons, inasmuch as they are the necessary fruit of his contact with the leading philosophers of the whole civilized world of his own day, and must represent that in which all were agreed, shorn of all weeds of controversy. Thus, the determined stand made by Pythagoras in defense of pure monotheism is sufficient evidence that the tradition to the effect that the unity of God was the supreme secret of all the ancient initiations is substantially correct. The philosophical school of Pythagoras was, in a measure, also a series of initiations, for he caused his pupils to pass through a series of degrees and never permitted them personal contact with himself until they had reached the higher grades. According to his biographers, his degrees were three in number. The first, that of mathematicus, assuring his pupils proficiency in mathematics and geometry, which was then, as it would be now, if masonry were properly inculcated, the basis upon which all other knowledge was erected. Secondly, the degree of theoreticus, which dealt with superficial applications of the exact sciences. And lastly, the degree of electus, which entitled the candidate to pass forward into the light of the fullest illumination which he was capable of absorbing. The pupils of the Pythagorean school were divided into exoterici, or pupils in the outer grades, and exoterici after they had passed the third degree of initiation and were entitled to the secret wisdom. Silence, secrecy, and unconditional obedience were cardinal principles of this great order. Pythagorean Fundamentals. The study of geometry, music, and astronomy was considered essential to a rational understanding of God, man, or nature, and no one could accompany Pythagoras as a disciple who was not thoroughly familiar with these sciences. Many came seeking admission to his school. Each applicant was tested on these three subjects, and if found ignorant, was summarily dismissed. Pythagoras was not an extremist. He taught moderation in all things rather than excess in anything, for he believed that an excess of virtue was in itself a vice. One of his favorite statements was, "We must avoid with our utmost endeavor and amputate with fire and sword, and by all other means from the body, sickness from the soul, ignorance from the belly, luxury from a city, sedition from a family, discord, and from all things excess." Pythagoras also believed that there was no crime equal to that of anarchy. All men know what they want, but few know what they need. Pythagoras warned his disciples that when they prayed, they should not pray for themselves, that when they asked things of the gods, they should not ask things for themselves, because no man knows what is good for him, and it is for this reason undesirable to ask for things which, if obtained, would only prove to be injurious. The god of Pythagoras was the monad, or the one that is everything. He described God as the supreme mind distributed throughout all parts of the universe, the cause of all things, the intelligence of all things, and the power within all things. He further declared the motion of God to be circular, the body of God to be composed of the substance of light, and the nature of God to be composed of the substance of truth. Pythagoras declared that the eating of meat clouded the reasoning faculties. While he did not condemn its use or totally abstain therefrom himself, he declared that judges should refrain from eating meat before a trial, in order that those who appeared before them might receive the most honest and astute decisions. When Pythagoras decided, as he often did, to retire into the temple of God for an extended period of time to meditate and pray, he took with his supply of specially prepared food and drink. The food consisted of equal parts of the seeds of poppy and sesame, the skin of the sea onion from which the juice had been thoroughly extracted, the flower of daffodil, the leaves of mallows, and a paste of barley and peas. These he compounded together with the addition of wild honey. For a beverage, he took the seeds of cucumbers, dried raisins with seeds removed, the flowers of coriander, the seeds of mallows and purslane, scraped cheese, meal, and cream mixed together and sweetened with wild honey. Pythagoras claimed that this was the diet of Hercules while wandering in the Libyan desert, and was according to the formula given to that hero by the goddess Ceres herself. The favorite method of healing among the Pythagoreans was the aid of poultices. These people also knew the magic properties of vast numbers of plants. Pythagoras highly esteemed the medicinal properties of the sea onion, and he is said to have written an entire volume on the subject. Such a work, however, is not known at the present time. Pythagoras discovered that music had great therapeutic power, and he prepared special harmonies for various diseases. He apparently experimented also with color, attaining considerable success. One of his unique curative processes resulted from his discovery of the healing value of certain verses from the Odyssey and the Iliad of Homer. These he caused to be read to persons suffering from certain ailments. He was opposed to surgery in all its forms and also objected to cauterizing. He would not permit the disfigurement of the human body, for such, in his estimation, was a sacrilege against the dwelling place of the gods. Pythagoras taught that friendship was the truest and nearest perfect of all relationships. He declared that in nature there was a friendship of all for all, of gods for men, of doctrines one for another, of the soul for the body, of the rational part of the irrational part, of philosophy for its theory, of men for one another, of countrymen for one another, that friendship also existed between strangers, between a man and his wife, his children and his servants. All bonds without friendship were shackles, and there was no virtue in their maintenance. Pythagoras believed that relationships were essentially mental rather than physical, and that a stranger of sympathetic intellect was closer to him than a blood relation whose viewpoint was at variance with his own. Pythagoras defined knowledge as the fruitage of mental accumulation. He believed that it would be obtained in many ways, but principally through observation. Wisdom was the understanding of the source of all or cause of all things, and this could be secured only by raising the intellect to a point where it intuitively cognized the invisible manifesting outwardly through the visible, and thus became capable of bringing itself in rapport with the spirit of things rather than with their forms. The ultimate source that wisdom could cognize was the monad, the mysterious permanent atom of the Pythagoreans. Pythagoras taught that both man and the universe were made in the image of God, that both being made in the same image, the understanding of one predicated the knowledge of the other. He further taught that there was a constant interplay between the grand man, the universe, and the man, the little universe. Pythagoras believed that all the sidereal bodies were alive and that the forms of the planets and stars were merely bodies encasing souls, minds, and spirits in the same manner that the visible human form is but the encasing vehicle for an invisible spiritual organism, which is in reality the conscious individual. Pythagoras regarded the planets as magnificent deities worthy of the adoration and respect of man. All these deities, however, he considered subservient to the one first cause within whom they all existed temporarily, as mortality exists in the midst of immortality. The famous Pythagorean Y signified the power of choice and was used in the mysteries as emblematic of the forking of the ways. The central stem separated into two parts, one branching to the right and the other to the left. The branch to the right was called divine wisdom, and the one to the left, earthly wisdom. Youth, personified by the candidate walking the path of life, symbolized by the central stem of the Y, reaches the point where the path divides. The neophyte must then choose whether he will take the left-hand path and, following the dictates of his lower nature, enter upon a span of folly and thoughtlessness, which will inevitably result in his undoing, or whether he will take the right-hand road and, through integrity, industry, and sincerity, ultimately regain union with the immortals and the superior spheres. It is probable that Pythagoras obtained his concept of the Y from the Egyptians, who included in certain of their initiatory rituals a scene in which the candidate was confronted by two female figures. One of them, veiled with the white robes of the temple, urged the neophyte to enter into the halls of learning, the other, bedecked with jewels symbolizing earthly treasures and bearing in her hands a tray loaded with grapes, emblematic of false light, sought to lure him into the chambers of dissipation. This symbol is still preserved among the tarot cards, where it is called the forking of the ways. The forked stick has been the symbol of life among many nations, and it was placed in the desert to indicate the presence of water. Concerning the theory of transmigration as disseminated by Pythagoras, there are differences of opinion. According to one view, he taught that mortals who during their earthly existence had by their actions become like certain animals returned to earth again in the form of the beast which they had grown to resemble. Thus, a timid person would return in the form of a rabbit or a deer, a cruel person in the form of a wolf or other ferocious animal, and a cunning person in the guise of a fox. This concept, however, does not fit into the general Pythagorean scheme, and it is far more likely that it was given in an allegorical rather than a literal sense. It was intended to convey the idea that human beings become bestial when they allow themselves to be dominated by their own lower desires and destructive tendencies. It is probable that the term transmigration is to be understood as what is more commonly called reincarnation, a doctrine which Pythagoras must have contracted directly or indirectly in India and Egypt. The fact that Pythagoras accepted the theory of successive reappearances of the spiritual nature in human form is found in a footnote to Levi's History of Magic. He was an important champion of what used to be called the doctrine of metempsychosis, understood as the soul's transmigration into successive bodies. He himself had been A. Athalides, a son of Mercury, B. Euphorbus, son of Panthus, who perished at the hands of Menelaus in the Trojan War, C. Hermodamus, a prophet of Clazmenae, a city in Ionia, D. a humble fisherman, and finally E. the philosopher of Samos. Pythagoras also taught that each species of creatures had what he termed a seal given to it by God, and that the physical form of each was the impression of this seal upon the wax of physical substance. Thus, each body was stamped with the dignity of its divinely given pattern. Pythagoras believed that ultimately man would reach a state where he would cast off his gross nature and function in a body of spiritualized ether, which would be in juxtaposition to his physical form at all times, and which might be the eighth sphere or antichthon. From this, he would ascend into the realm of the immortals, where by divine birthright he belonged. Pythagoras taught that everything in nature was divisible into three parts, and that no one could become truly wise who did not view every problem as being diagrammatically triangular. He said, establish the triangle and the problem is 2/3 solved. Further, all things consist of three. In conformity with this viewpoint, Pythagoras divided the universe into three parts, which he called the supreme world, the superior world, and the inferior world. The highest or supreme world was a subtle, interpenetrative spiritual essence pervading all things, and therefore the true plane of the supreme deity itself. The deity being in every sense omnipresent, omniactive, omnipotent, and omniscient. Both of the lower worlds existed within the nature of this supreme sphere. The superior world was the home of the immortals. It was also the dwelling place of the archetypes or the seals. Their natures in no manner partook of the material or earthiness, but they, casting their shadows upon the deep, the inferior world, were cognizable only through their shadows. The third or inferior world was the home of those creatures who partook of material substance or were engaged in labor with or upon material substance. Hence, this sphere was the home of the mortal gods, the demiurgi, the angels who labor with men, also the demons who partake of the nature of the earth, and finally mankind and the lower kingdoms, who's temporarily of the earth, but capable of rising above that sphere by reason and philosophy. The digits 1 and 2 are not considered numbers by the Pythagoreans because they typify the two supermundane spheres. The Pythagorean numbers therefore begin with 3, the triangle, and 4, the square. These added to the 1 and the 2 produce the 10, the great number of all things, the archetype of the universe. The three worlds were called receptacles. The first was the receptacle of principles, the second was the receptacle of intelligences, and the third, or lowest, was the receptacle of quantities. The symmetrical solids were regarded by Pythagoras and by the Greek thinkers after him as of the greatest importance. To be perfectly symmetrical or regular, a solid must have an equal number of faces meeting at each of its angles, and these faces must be equal regular polygons, or figures whose sides and angles are all equal. Pythagoras perhaps may be credited with the great discovery that there are only 5 such solids. Now, the Greeks believed the world material universe to be composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water, and to the Greek mind the conclusion was inevitable that the shapes of the particles of the elements were those of the regular solids. Earth particles were cubical, the cube being the regular solid possessed of the greatest stability. Fire particles were tetrahedral, the tetrahedron being the simplest and hence lightest solid. Water particles were icosahedral for exactly the reverse reason, whilst air particles, as intermediate between the two latter, were octahedral. The dodecahedron was to these ancient mathematicians the most mysterious of the solids. It was by far the most difficult to construct the accurate drawing of the regular pentagon, necessitating a rather elaborate application of Pythagoras' great theorem. Hence the conclusion, as Plato put it, that the regular dodecahedron, the deity employed in tracing the plan of the universe. The symmetrical geometric solids. To the 5 symmetrical solids of the ancients is added the sphere. 1, the most perfect of all created forms. The 5 Pythagorean solids are the tetrahedron, 2, with 4 equilateral triangles as faces, the cube, 3, with 6 squares as faces, the octahedron, 4, with 8 equilateral triangles as bases, the icosahedron, 5, with 20 equilateral triangles as bases, and the dodecahedron, 6, with 12 regular pentagons as bases. Number related to form. Pythagoras taught that the dot symbolized the power of the number 1, the line, the power of the number 2, the surface, the power of the number 3, and the solid, the power of the number 4. Mr. Redgrove has not mentioned the 5th element of the ancient mysteries, that which would make the analogy between the symmetrical solids and the elements complete. This 5th element, or ether, was called by the Hindus akasa. It was closely correlated with the hypothetical ether of modern science and was the interpenetrative substance permeating all of the other elements and acting as a common solvent and common denominator of them. The 12-based solid also subtly referred to the 12 immortals who surfaced the universe, and also the 12 convolutions of the human brain, the vehicles of those immortals in the nature of man. After having drunk from a certain spring one day, one of the masters of Pythagoras announced that the spirit of the water had just predicted that a great earthquake would occur the next day, a prophecy which was fulfilled. It is highly probable that Pythagoras possessed hypnotic power not only over man but also over animals. He caused a bird to change the course of its flight, a bear to cease its ravages upon a community, and a bull to change its diet by the exercise of mental influence. He was also gifted with second sight, being able to see things at a distance and accurately describe incidents that had not yet come to pass. While Pythagoras, in accordance with others of his day, practiced divination, possibly arithmomancy, there is no accurate information concerning the methods which he used. He is believed to have had a remarkable will by means of which he could predict future events and to have learned hydromancy from the Egyptians. He believed that brass had oracular powers because even when everything was perfectly still, there was always a rumbling sound in brass bowls. He once addressed a prayer to the spirit of a river, and out of the water arose a voice. Pythagoras, I greet thee. It is claimed for him that he was able to cause demons to enter into water and disturb its surface, and by means of the agitations, certain things were predicted. The symbolic aphorisms of Pythagoras. Imblicus gathered 39 of the symbolic sayings of Pythagoras and interpreted them. These have been translated from the Greek by Thomas Taylor. Aphorismic statement was one of the favorite methods of instruction used in the Pythagorean University of Crotona. 10 of the most representative of these aphorisms are reproduced below with a brief elucidation of their concealed meanings. 1. Declining from the public ways, walk in unfrequented paths. By this it is to be understood that those who desire wisdom must seek it in solitude. 2. Govern your tongue before all other things, following the gods. This aphorism warns man that his words, instead of representing him, misrepresent him, and that when in doubt as to what he should say, he should always be silent. 3. The wind blowing, adore the sound. Pythagoras here reminds his disciples that the fiat of God is heard in the voice of the elements, and that all things in nature manifest through harmony, rhythm, order, or procedure, the attributes of the deity. 4. Assist a man in raising a burden, but do not assist him in laying it down. The student is instructed to aid the diligent, but never to assist those who seek to evade their responsibilities, for it is a great sin to encourage indolence. 5. Speak not about Pythagorean concerns without light. The world is herein warned that it should not attempt to interpret the mysteries of God and the secrets of the sciences without spiritual and intellectual illumination. 6. Having departed from your house, turn not back, for the Furies will be your attendants. Pythagoras here warns his followers that any who begin the search for truth and, after having learned part of the mystery, become discouraged and attempt to return again to their former ways of vice and ignorance will suffer exceedingly. For it is better to know nothing about divinity than to learn a little and then stop without learning all. 7. Nourish a cock, but sacrifice it not, for it is sacred to the sun and moon. 2 great lessons are concealed in this aphorism. The first is a warning against the sacrifice of living things to the gods, because life is sacred and man should not destroy it, even as an offering to the deity. The second warns man that the human body here referred to as a cock is sacred to the sun god and the moon nature, and should be guarded and preserved as man's most precious medium of expression. Pythagoras also warned his disciples against suicide. 8. Receive not a swallow into your house. This warns the seeker after truth not to follow drifting thoughts to come into his mind, nor shiftless persons to enter into his life. He must ever surround himself with rationally inspired thinkers and with conscientious workers. 9. Offer not your right hand easily to anyone. This warns the disciple to keep his own counsel and not offer wisdom and knowledge, his right hand, to such as are incapable of appreciating them. The hand here represents truth, which raises those who have fallen because of ignorance. But as many of the unregenerate do not desire wisdom, they will cut off the hand that is extended in kindness to them. Time alone can effect the redemption of the ignorant masses. 10. When rising from the bedclothes, roll them together and obliterate the impression of the body. Pythagoras directed his disciples who had awakened from the sleep of ignorance into the waking state of intelligence to eliminate from their recollection all memory of their formal spiritual darkness. For a wise man in passing leaves no form behind him, which others less intelligent seeing shall use as a mold for the casting of idols. The most famous of the Pythagorean fragments are the golden verses ascribed to Pythagoras himself, but concerning whose authorship there is an element of doubt. The golden verses contain a brief summary of the entire system of philosophy, forming the basis of the educational doctrines of Crotona, or as it is more commonly known, the Italic school. These verses open by counseling the reader to love God, venerate the great heroes, and respect the daemons and elemental inhabitants. They then urge man to think carefully and industrially concerning his daily life, and to prefer the treasures of the mind and soul to accumulations of earthly goods. The verses also promise man that if he will rise above his lower material nature and cultivate self-control, he will ultimately be acceptable in the sight of the gods, be reunited with them, and partake of their immortality. It is rather significant to note that Plato paid a great price for some of the manuscripts of Pythagoras, which had been saved from the destruction of Crotona. Okay, we're going to leave it here and come back on Pythagorean astronomy. So catch me back here later, guys. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Peace.